Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, friends and family. We are here to celebrate the life of Judy Wittner. My name is Jenny Wittner, and I am Judy's daughter. On behalf of myself and my sister, I want to thank you for being here today to share with us your memories and this moment for Judy. Your presence means a lot to us and would have meant a lot to Mom too. I am very certain she would be sorry she missed this. For those of you joining us via video link, your presence is felt by us too here and lifts us up. On a cold winter day in December, probably around 1972, Mom took me walking in downtown Boston. We were probably in Boston because my grandmother lived there and we would go and visit, but I have no idea why we were in deserted downtown Boston at that moment. Boston today, I presume, looks very different than it does then, but at that moment it was deserted and forbidding and a little bit ugly. There was no one on the street. We were walking and we turned a corner, and when we turned the corner we saw, in fact, it wasn't true that there was no one on the street. There were 3 men sitting on the sidewalk, huddled around a little fire. Obviously, these were men who had no place else to be, because who else would be on the street around a fire on a cold day? I think that most people at that point would have seen 2 choices. One choice would be to walk on by. A second choice would be to hand them some coins and then walk on by. But my mother saw a third choice. She went up to them, she introduced herself, and she asked if we could sit with them for a while. And so we did. Mom asked them about their lives, their backgrounds, their families, and we sat there and we talked in the cold for a while. I do not know what those men thought of her, but I know that I was shocked even. I had no idea that people who lived on the street were just people like us. And I'm ashamed to say that it had never occurred to me until then. But to Mom, of course it was so. And that was my mother's great gift in the world, to believe that everyone, no matter their circumstances, no matter their presentation to the world, was human and mattered. I want to fast forward a few decades to tell you a story from the end of her life. Most of you know that in her last years, Mom's life was not what she would have wanted it to be, nor what we would have wanted it to be for her. But those were still years in her life, and I want to talk about them and honor them as well. Dementia robbed her of a lot of the things that she loved to do before, and one of those things was it robbed her of the ability to have conversation. In the last years of her life, she was almost nonverbal. I would go and visit with her and spend an hour there, and maybe she would nod or say yes or no in response to questions or say a few words, but she almost never initiated conversation. About a year ago on a day very much like today, I was sitting outside with her in the place where we lived, and it was a normal day. I had brought my dog with me to visit her. She loved that dog at the end. And I was probably chatting away. Maybe I was talking about my garden and what was growing in the garden at the time. Maybe I was observing the dog do his things. And all of a sudden she stopped me. I just realized I have a mask on. I know. All of a sudden she stopped me, and she stopped me. "Jenny," she said. Up until that point, I wasn't even convinced that she knew who I was, but obviously she knew who I was. "Jenny," she said, and she looked very hard at me. "Your shirt is inside out." She was right. It was inside out. For a minute, Mom was back with that same intonation, with that same power of observation. She was herself for a minute. And that was a gift. It was one of the last times that she spoke to me in that way, and I will remember it until I also am gone. One of the things about Mom is she had a very sharp sense of humor, and she also loved to laugh at herself. And so we developed a number of family stories that we would tell over and over again and find them as hilarious the 50th time as we did the first time. And Mom, they were all about her, and Mom would laugh and nod her head along with them each time they were told. And so for perhaps one last time, I'm going to tell you one of these family stories, and I hope we can imagine Mom here laughing and nodding along as I tell this story. This also took place in a winter day in December, but this time it was in Evanston here at our home. My sister was in college. Liz had come home for winter break. I no longer lived in the house, so I was not there. But Liz had come home for winter break and then had gone out to a party that evening. At that party, she met an ex-boyfriend. She ran into an ex-boyfriend who had no place to stay. So having no place to stay, she offered him my room because I was not in it, and she brought him back to the house. Mom had already gone to bed. This was late. And so Liz installed him in my bedroom and then went off to her bedroom to sleep herself. As it happened, Mom had found an alarm clock in her room. She'd been cleaning out her dresser drawers earlier in the day and had found an alarm clock in the dresser drawers. She had left the alarm clock on top of her dresser and put it there and gone to bed. Well, of course, the alarm clock went off at 3 in the morning. She couldn't get it to turn off. Her solution was to run this alarm clock into my room. Now, remember who's in my room. Did I tell you that my mom was sleeping naked? She was. Into the room bursts my mother, flips on the light, and stands there with a ringing and alarm clock, entirely naked, in front of Liz's shocked ex-boyfriend, who the next morning snuck out without a word. This is a story we love to tell over and over again, and we laugh at it every time. Maybe in the back, once we break and talk, we can tell you some of the other stories. Anyway, thank you once again for joining us in this celebration of Mom. I will ask our speakers to come to the podium one by one after the other. Chris Wellen, you're first. There's a slight variation in that, but I'll help you all change that.
Good afternoon. I'm so pleased to be here to celebrate my dear friend, Judy Wittner, friend of some 30-odd years. I'd started graduate school nearby at Northwestern University, and I was interested in studying labor. I was going to study factory workers, and some of my dear friends and colleagues who were dear friends and colleagues of Judy's, including Bernard Beck, who perhaps is here, Howard Becker, and Arlene Daniels said, well, you should go to talk to Judy, because Judy is a mensch, and Judy is very smart, and she's like a member of the Klan. So down I went, second-year graduate student. She didn't know anything else about me, but she greeted me like an old friend. She had an abiding curiosity about other people, so rather than take any time to speak about her research or what she had published or any of the sort of academic cant that you might have expected, she just wanted to know about me, how would I come to these questions, how could she be of help. So I want to talk just a little bit in my brief time about the part of Judy that I knew, which has to do with academic sociology, to which she devoted a lot of her life, but earlier in her life she did, of course, other things. And so she was part of a lineage, and ultimately she was part of a revolution. A part of the lineage, I think, was about ethnography, because it was still the case that that kind of detailed description of everyday life, including institutions. Judy studied foster care, and she studied other institutions that we like to think are helping institutions, but can also breed a lot of inhumanity. And so I remember talking with her, because that was my orientation, was to ethnography, about how subversive it really is to describe the conditions in which people live, and that she was really committed to that. She was also committed to politics and to social class analysis. And so she had these deep kind of intellectual traditions in which she was working. But I think in her own life, as a mother and as a person who had had other experiences, there was perhaps something missing on the map of sociology. She was trying to find her place within that sort of cosmos. And in the mid-70s and beyond, that happened with a kind of a wave of feminist critique within sociology. And so Judy had a notion of labor and class, and she had a very powerful method, but something that spoke to her own life and spoke to these new intellectual currents was very exciting. And I remember talking about the work of Dorothy Smith. Just briefly, Dorothy Smith had published a very daunting essay that I struggled with, called, looking at sociology from women's standpoint. And when you did that, you realized how impoverished, really, academic sociology was. When they looked at labor, they didn't look at domestic labor. They didn't look at caring labor. It was oddly bereft of some of the questions that were very compelling for Judy. So she became a champion of critical feminist sociology, and for decades, she created institutional spaces at Loyola, particularly, and in other places, that had not been there to nurture her. And so first we want to acknowledge those people at Northwestern who gave her that support and encouragement. And she was a very generative person. And so she helped to create those networks. There were groups that were far beyond her local scene, groups like Sociologists for Women in Society, the Care Work Network, that really created an institutional space for people across many disciplines: philosophy, history, sociology, anthropology, activism. She created and helped to create institutional spaces where those people could do their work. And so it was, very, very remarkable accomplishment to claim within one career. Final thing I'll say is that she did a lot of distinguished writing. She wrote about oral history. She wrote about a wonderful collaborator in a book about religious groups gathering in diaspora. She was interested in community. But when I was part of a group of friends who helped to move her out of her office, she evinced a lot of regret. She minimized her own contributions as a scholar. She was, as I would tell her, modesty is a great thing, but you wouldn't want to take it too far. Judy was modest to a fault. And in a way, I remember one of the things I said to her is that the caring ethic that she supported in her research for decades among so many other people, in a way she minimized that contribution that she herself had made, really, to caring for other people. So I think that kind of echoes perhaps what Jenny said earlier. So she was a wonderful friend, a teacher, a very warm person, and she's a big presence in my life and will remain so forever. Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. As hard as the occasion is, I feel incredibly fortunate to be here and be thinking and speaking about my Aunt Judy. Aunt Judy was my And Judy was my aunt. Oh my goodness, I'm nervous. Yes, she was my aunt. And I would like to start just by saying that I'm here representing my mother, who cannot be here right now because she needs to be particularly careful because of COVID, and also my father, whose flight was canceled last night when he was trying to get here. So on their behalf, I'm here. I guess I'll say first that my father, who is Uncle Lauren Wittner's brother, met Judy Wittner when he was 13, and I have heard him talk about her my whole life as somebody who made a huge impression on him from the time he was 13 ever forward, and I know he really would like to be here with all of us. My mother was also close to Judy from the time she met her, and I'm going to say a few words that she wrote about her. Before I do that, I'm just going to say a few quick words of my own. Aunt Judy, my aunt, was a very important figure in my life for many different reasons. I think that I'll start by saying that she created two of the most important people in my life and the best role models that a person could ever have in my cousins Jenny and Liz. And I want to thank you, Uncle Lauren, and you, Aunt Judy, for creating these humans. I don't think there are two better people on the planet, honestly. And they have been guiding forces in my life for my entire life, and their children are now people that my own children adore. So I thank her for that greatly. I also want to say that as a teacher of young people, of high school students, and a parent and just a human being, I am not sure right now where to turn to figure out how to fix the very great problems that are happening in our world and our country. I don't have any wise words for my students ever anymore right now, for my students or my own children. And I took a long walk this morning because I was feeling very despondent about that, and having just left my high school students 2 days ago with questions that I cannot answer about the state of the world. And as I was walking, I thought about my Aunt Judy, and I realized that I don't remember her ever being despondent. I remember her being passionate, determined, focused, unapologetic. And I remember her fighting for racial equity, gender equity, and so much more, as somebody just spoke about. I remember her talking about fighting against the Vietnam War, for civil rights for everyone, and for reproductive freedom. And I remember, as I said, I don't remember her ever being despondent, only determined. Her time was no less troubled than the time that we're in. And so it made me realize that all I can do is work to follow in her footsteps, to learn every bit I can about her life, even more than I already know, and do my best to do what she did, which is use her voice to make change in the world. I'm wearing platform shoes today. My Aunt Judy, I don't think, would ever be seen in platform shoes. I remember her always wearing comfortable Clark's shoes. And so I think I'm going to trade these in, because my memory of her in those Clark shoes was that there was no time to waste. It was all about getting things done and taking action. And that is what I want to inspire me when I go back to talk to my students and my own children next week. Okay, so now I'm going to read to you from my mother. Speaking on her behalf, of course. I am Jenny and Liz's Aunt Barbara, and I'm deeply honored to have the opportunity to share my reflections on Judy with you today. While I'm very sad to not be with all of you in person, I'm grateful that my daughter Lisa can read these words for me, and that I can be with you virtually as we celebrate Judy. I began writing this about Judy, but realized somewhere along the way that I wanted to write this to her. So, dear Judy, I know that many others will speak today about your extraordinary accomplishments as an academic, a civil rights activist, a feminist, a writer, and a mentor, and about the courage that it took for you to take on the world against so many odds. I so admired your unyielding commitment to social justice and all that you did to make the world a better place, and I'm grateful for the role model you were for me and for Lisa that informs our own activism today. But I want to use my time here to talk for just a few minutes about your heart, about your warm smile and easy laugh, your generous spirit, and your always open arms. You and I were married to 2 brothers, and were first sisters-in-law and later former sisters-in-law. But these words can't possibly describe the actual relationship we shared as we formed a tight bond in those early years and remained deeply connected over the course of more than 5 decades. Despite the 800 miles that separated us and the changing reality of our respective families. While there is so much to say, here are just a few things that I want you to know. Judy, I love that we were able to go for long periods of time without seeing each other or even talking. But when it felt like too much time had passed, one of us would call, and we'd just pick up where we left off without missing a beat, often talking late into the night. No apologies for not staying in touch, just open hearts that were so happy to connect again. I love that we almost shared a birthday, mine on October 17th, excuse me, and yours on the 20th. I could always look forward to your call on my birthday, which you never ever forgot. And even after a long conversation, I would be so happy to talk again 3 days later on yours. It was also great to be able to laugh with you about these invariably being the second calls we each received on our birthdays. The first, of course, was from Nana, the mother-in-law we shared, because she had to be the first, which many of you will understand. It always came at 5:30 or 6 o'clock in the morning. The calls kept us connected across the miles, but it's the visits to South Boulevard that are seared with such warm feelings in my heart. Standing on your front porch with your open arms and your big gap tooth smile, you always made us feel so completely welcome in your home. I love that soon after we arrived, you and I would start puttering around in the kitchen, snipping herbs from your garden, and finding things to put together to make a totally impromptu, inventive, and delicious meal, using whatever happened to be around. Unlike me, who tends to over-plan everything, you never liked to plan ahead. You liked the spontaneity of just doing things in the moment, and you made it so much fun for me and for all of us. We might have that meal around the table in your dining room, a table that always had room for 1 more, or 5 or 6 more. With you, there was always room at the table for anyone who wanted or needed to be there. Family, friends, friends of friends, and sometimes almost complete strangers, something I so loved about you. And the best meals, or at least my favorite ones, were the picnics in your backyard. We might have been sitting in rickety chairs, but we were surrounded by your spectacular flowers and the long stream of friends and neighbors who would just keep stopping by to join us. I feel so lucky that in the waning days of your life, I had the chance with Lisa to spend some time with you. While I could see how challenging life was becoming for you, and that made me sad, the essence of your being was all still there. Your great big heart, your generous spirit, your readiness to laugh, and your open arms. It filled me up as it always had just to be with you. Judy, I'm so grateful for all the special times we had together. I'll be missing the phone calls, cooking together in your kitchen, sharing meals around your dinner table, and in your backyard, and so much more. But please know that I'll always be holding you close in my heart. Much love, Barbara.
I am not Ann Figert. Ann could not be here today because of COVID. So we're sorry that Ann's not here in person. Knowing Ann as well as I do, I know that she will forgive me for mingling some of my thoughts with hers, because I do have her prepared remarks to read here this afternoon. Like Ann, like all of you, I've been thinking of my dear friend Judy in recent months and thinking, how would I describe Judy to a stranger? And many words came to my mind, but one that kept returning was spirited And I thought, spirited, why does that word come to my mind? What does it even mean? And mostly I thought, would Judy be offended by that? Because there are many labels that Judy rejected. So I looked up the word in the dictionary, and it said spirited, full of energy, enthusiasm, and determination. And I said, yeah, it's a good word for Judy, spirited. As I said, Judy was my friend for actually more than 50 years. And I don't remember exactly when we first met. I know we were both members of NAM, the New American Movement, which was a socialist feminist organization in the 1970s that was doing anti-war work. And Judy and I were both involved in political work before we came to Loyola together. And there were so many political meetings. Since Judy had had her children, Jenny and Liz, at a relatively young age, many of those meetings were held in her living room, so she could still keep an eye on her girls and not miss anything that was going on. Later, the meetings continued to be held in her living room because the rest of us were having babies, and Liz and Jenny could keep an eye on our kids, so we would not miss anything that was going on. Judy always had a way of making things work out. I would now like to read some of, before I get to Anne's reflections, let me say one more thing about how long I've known Judy. Judy and I were part of a new cohort in the sociology department at Loyola University. We just thought we were going to change everything. In 1976, Judy, Ken Johnson, Kirsten Gronberg, and I joined the department, and 2 years later, Phil Neiden and Peter Wally joined us. And I know that Judy would agree when I say we were all pretty darn excited to get those contracts for $14,000 a year. We all worked together, we taught courses together, we watched each other's children, we had dinners together, we celebrated holidays together, we hosted works in progress sessions with graduate students at our homes. Most of us in that cohort did not have, well, I think all of us, did not have extended family in Chicago, so we helped each other out. I remember when I was in the hospital, Judy kept my son for a while. She kept reminding me of how we played the piano in her living room. But it was a very special time for us. And Loyola Sociology Department was a very special place for us. We were all excited to be there because despite the salary, we had tenure track positions. And those were really golden years for Judy, for all of us. I'm now going to read some of Anne's words. As academics, we tend to measure our lives in articles and books, grants and awards. We even call our version of a resume a curriculum vitae, or Latin for the course of one's life. Judy Wittner had all of the academic successes listed on her CV. Judy retired in 2015 as a full professor of sociology after 39 years of teaching and research at Loyola. She was an active participant in sociology at all levels and one of the founding mothers of women's studies at Loyola in 1979. Although she would not tell you this herself, she was an expert in ethnographic research and women's and gender studies. She was invited to teach field methods and gender studies in workshops or in visiting professorships across the world. She was the co-author of a best-selling book on the sociology of gender called Gender Worlds. It's now in its 4th edition with Oxford University Press, and it's in the back. Probably not an autographed copy, but there's one back there. Judy was also the co-editor of Gatherings in Diaspora, Religious Communities, and the New Immigration with Temple University Press. Judy was a Sujak Master Teacher at Loyola, which is the highest teaching award Loyola gives. She was Mentor of the Year from Sociologists for Women in Society, and her CV goes on and on. But Judy was so much more than her CV. As we gather here today and listen to stories and tell stories, certain themes will certainly run through those remembrances. One of those is that Judy was a force of nature. She was spirited. She has had a major impact on her friends, faculty, and especially students. Anne received texts and emails and posts from former students and colleagues all over the world who knew and loved Judy and talked about the lasting impact of her presence in their lives, and I know some of those students are here today. Judy thought sociology should not just be an academic discipline, but should engage the community and engage public policy, and she did that. She was the person who cared deeply and passionately about people and society. She was wise, compassionate, and yes, sometimes aggravating. She was a mentor, a teacher, a friend to students, staff, and faculty colleagues alike. Sit down was a common invitation, and indeed Judy's office and home were often the gathering places for both faculty and students to sit down and talk about sociology, politics, life. As an exemplary qualitative researcher, Judy was incredibly funny and would sometimes state that one of her proudest achievements was that A she got in graduate statistics at Northwestern. Anne has listed here some other favorite Judyisms, as she called them. Show me, don't tell me. No good deed goes unpunished. This too shall pass. Instead of, are you sure you want to do that, she would ask, why do you want to do that? And organize, always be on the front lines. One of the most important lessons Judy has taught us to study the world, study up, not down. She believed that it is our responsibility as sociologists to study and fight for those who do not have power, and yes, to try and make the world a better and more just place. When Judy wasn't in her office at Loyola, she attended events on campus, professional meetings, and even helped to organize the food service workers on Loyola's campus. She was constantly at political marches or organizing, supporting people from all walks of life. Judy was the conscience of the department and the university. And actually, I've heard that from many people who wrote to me after Judy's death, people who have retired from the university, expressing sentiments very like that, that Judy was a moral compass for them during their years together at Loyola. No matter what the issue, Judy was there to speak truth to power, always on the side of the oppressed. She marched, she listened, she organized, she encouraged colleagues and students to do the same with honesty, wisdom, and generosity. She had an ability to draw people into conversations about issues that mattered. I want to depart from Anne's script for one more moment and just add an experience from my past with Judy, because Judy also liked to have fun. And I think that there are very few people who know that Judy and I, probably nobody here knows this, when we were quite young, we would go disco dancing on Rush Street. One of the reasons I think nobody knows this is that we probably didn't want anyone to know this. And it's, anybody who knows Judy and me knows this is pretty hard to imagine, right? You could hardly think of two people who are more clumsy dancers. But we were young once, and Judy and I liked to have fun. And I remember that. But I think most of Judy's fun was being with friends. Those political meetings that have been mentioned at her home, the large gatherings for dinner around her dining room table, the potluck suppers in the backyard, new friends, old friends, neighbors, strangers, homeless people. As so many have said, Judy had an open door, and she had an open heart. Anne says that she knows she is a better sociologist from talking and listening to Judy over the years together. But more importantly, she says, I am a better person for having Judy's passion, energy, and friendship in my life. I think we all feel that way. Most of us do not get to choose how and when we depart from this earth, and I know Judy would not have chosen to spend the last couple of years of her life as she was forced to. But we can choose how we treat other people and the gifts that we can impart to others. Anne and I, and all of us, miss Judy dearly. It's hard for me to believe after 50 years that she won't be there for a phone call, a conversation. I miss her dearly, and I'm glad that we can all be here together to celebrate her life. May her memory continue to be a blessing for all of us.
Hi, I'm Susan Stahl, and I am here because of a 30-year relationship with Judy, as first a graduate student, but not at Loyola or Northwestern, and then as a colleague, as a sister sociologist. My first introduction to Judy was on a panel at the Midwest Sociology meetings in 1980 at the Iowa Midwest Sociology meetings. She was the discussant for the first conference presentation of my dissertation research, and I was very nervous because I was laying out there the research that I'd been working on for 2 years on small-town women. Not until later panel opportunities would I appreciate the superb quality and gift of Judy's thoughtful and immediately useful comments. They were amazing comments. I'd never been on a panel, I'd never had a discussant, and I didn't know how great those comments were. 2 years later, when I moved to Chicago, Judy was the person I first contacted. Generous with her time, she offered thoughtful advice about professional next steps. While I was becoming a sociologist, in my eyes, Judy was sociologist extraordinaire, because she exemplified for me all the way I wanted to practice sociology. She wasn't pompous, although published, she wasn't pompous about things. As people have said very well, she was really interested in the person that she was with, and she was very excited that I was starting on this path, which would end eventually with a tenure-track position. But I didn't know that, and to me it was all very scary. Plus, I hadn't started writing my real dissertation yet. Due to our shared commitment to women's studies, eventually together, and to political activism in its various shapes and forms, our paths crossed numerous times in the 80s and early 90s. One organization we were both engaged in distinct but complementary ways, was Women United for a Better Chicago. This was a nonprofit that was unique. It was birthed out of the Harold Washington campaign. And while I was studying and organizing conferences about local women and their housing inequities, Judy researched Chicago's specialized domestic violence court, a model nationally, by accompanying women and men complainants from the time they initiated charges to the final disposition of their cases. That her research, her ethnographies, was immediately useful and empowering information, not only across the United States, actually. It was a pivotal moment in the early 1990s when a colleague and I, Martha Thompson, and she's watching us virtually today from Fort Collins, we extended an invitation to Judy to help us invigorate our floundering writing group. Without hesitation, Judy joined us to create probably one of the most crucial supports of my career. The three of us believed deeply in the relationship between research and activism, and our role as activist researchers. We met monthly in turn, sharing and carefully and kindly critiquing each other's work. No type of writing was off the table. From letters to the editor and feminist newsletter reflections for Sociologists for Women in Society, to book reviews, journal articles, and eventually book chapters and books. Meeting for over 15 years, Judy increasingly played an essential role in both my professional and personal life. Monthly careful examinations of each other's writing soon included updates on our own lives. Caring advice about personal challenges was invited, and also at times raucous laughter erupted. Judy shared food and her flourishing garden in the summer, stories about her grandchildren, who I eventually got to meet a few of them, university gossip, and the celebration of her 70th birthday with us with tea and crumpets at the Drake. And there was actually a YouTube made of this that is very, very funny. But time progressed, and in the past few years, when Judy's increased memory loss, as you've all spoken of, was more and more apparent, the three of us no longer met to engage through our writing. But instead, we met to engage with Judy as a dear friend. I last met with Judy in the fall of last year. In reality, that morning, I conversed with Jenny, while Judy, like someone else mentioned in those years, seemed to be listening, but you couldn't tell. At one point, Jenny asked Judy something to the effect of, "Mom, do you know Susan's here?" "Yes," an irritated Judy responded. "Of course I know she's here." Thinking back, I see this as a gift from an accomplished, challenging, but loving woman. And ditto to everything everybody's been saying. Thank you so much for your comments.
Liz is up here because you'll see later this is sort of a joint production. So I'm Diane Horowitz, and like Kathy, I met Judy probably close to 50 years ago. It might have been NAM, the New American Movement. It might have been NUC. Some of you might have heard of that, the New University Conference, or it might have been the CWLU, the Chicago Women's Liberation Union. All, in hindsight, very short-lived, but really important movement organizations, at least to some of us in them. So like Judy, I was honed in the left, the anti-war, the socialist feminist movement of the 60s and 70s. But after my connections to her in those groups, over 15 years later, more, in 1990, I became her neighbor, moving just 3 blocks away, and I think that's when we became friends. So I'm here today to talk about something, not Judy as a sociologist, as an expert interviewer, as an academic, but another way that Judy had an impact on me, and some of you kind of mentioned that, and that is Judy as a master gardener. For those of you who are in the backyard on South Boulevard, over the years you saw her beautiful perennial garden. Oh, that's 822 Southport, and I'll tell you in a second. South Boulevard. Changing with the seasons, she was an avid, creative gardener, carefully nurturing her flowers, and even for a few years, venturing into vegetables, a raised bed with barriers to keep away the ubiquitous Evanston rabbits. I think she called it a kitchen garden. She grew tomatoes, basil, oregano, lettuce, kale, other things, all for her delicious dinner parties. When I retired from my community college teaching job over 20 years ago, Judy encouraged me to start a garden. Before that, my front yard, my side yard, and my backyard was all grass. She came over, dug up some of my grass, shared many of her plants, and took me under her green thumb. For many years, on the Saturday of Memorial Day, just like today, we would go to the Evanston Garden Swap together, Evanston Plant Swap together, bringing home new treasures for our gardens. She continued to share her flowers with me year after year, giving me advice about mulching, transplanting, how to separate plants. And most often, I really didn't follow her advice, sad to say. So my garden was never, ever as beautiful as hers. Last Sunday, a week ago, on a sunny morning, I walked over 3 blocks to 822 South Boulevard. There we go. Nothing in the front had changed much, just as Judy had left it. But the front door was wide open, much like Judy often had it, as few people said today. I would always say to her, "Judy, close the door," because she wasn't in the house, she was in the backyard, but she was more trusting than me. There was no answer, so I walked around to the back, where there was now a lock gate, a fence, to see 2 dogs, a baby, and a toddler. And then I learned an ETHS, Evanston Township teacher and firefighter who bought the house just over 2 years ago, the beginning of COVID and the beginning months of Judy at Belmont Village. I introduced myself, told them that Judy had died, that there was a memorial coming up, and asked if I could take pictures of her garden. Their faces kind of fell. Just a little left of the original garden, they said, "Here it is." And so there's Judy's raspberry bushes. Some of you remember them. And then I see nods. And then along the fence to the west, her daylilies. Daylilies. Why did I think I would find it? Just as she had it before she wasn't able to work in it anymore. And that's why I went over there. Why do I think that a perennial garden would be permanent when nothing much else is in this world? But every day in the late spring and summer, when I look out in my front yard or try to weed, there they are, reminders of Judy. Spiderwort, lilies, purple coneflowers, nodding, her pink phlox, iris in the spring. And I just want to say one more thing. I want to thank Liz and Jenny, Judy's 2 daughters, who I've known for a long time, but who took incredible responsibility and care during such challenging times. I know how tough it is, and know that Judy was so lucky to have both of them. And I also want to thank both Liz and Jenny for being so connected to her friends during this time. Thanks.
How do you do? I'm Tim Diamond, and excuse me, I've asked for 5 minutes, but since we have a special guest speaker at the end of my comments, it's probably going to be a little bit closer to 7.5. The title of my tribute is Sitting Around the Kitchen Table, not the dining room table. When I arrived in Chicago in the early 1980s, Judy and I met at a party. And she immediately, I don't want to say took me under her wing, more like took me into her garden, beautiful garden, as has been mentioned, but I mention it here more as a metaphor, in the sense that Judy and I had a particular fondness for a particular flower. Well, some would call it a weed, but we connected in a very bonded way and sat around her kitchen table for many years, complaining or laughing, just having a wonderful time around that kitchen table. I mention her today as a friend and a scholar and a activist and a pioneer. Judy's life was a life of service. When I met her, she was just getting the women's studies off the ground at Loyola, all the while tending to Helena Lopata or Cheryl Miller, or taking Arlene Daniels to the grocery store every Saturday. And then there were the Anna years, her mother, who sat in that front room, Judy, in a way that bounced off every room in the house. And Judy was attentive to her, right to her end, struggle as it was. Blessed Anna. Some of Judy's stellar comments still echo in my mind. Parking the car in Rogers Park one time. Judy, do you realize you just hit that person behind us? Oh, yes, I know. That's how I know I'm parked. That was Judy. Later on, when she was sick, you know, there's one thing I like about having cancer. People are so nice to you. And then there was the time when she emailed me to see if I wanted to belong to this group of sociologists. And I wrote back, I said, Judy, you're not going to drag me into that boring crowd, are you? Whereupon I pushed reply all and lost a half a dozen friends. But she was there, oh, don't worry. But worry. Now there's something that Judy did. I'm worried about Jenny and Alex and Nathaniel. God, I hope they offer him some health insurance down at that burger place where he works. You know, and Liz and John and Molly and Mario and Lily. Worry, come on, Judy, don't worry so much. Hey, that was an empty plea to this quintessential Jewish mother, certainly. As a scholar, utterly first rate. To paraphrase Steve Warner, I don't know if Steve's here today, but from their gatherings in diaspora, the study of the religious communities, this is Steve. We all benefited from her seasoned field research experience, mastery of literature, sociological conscience, and commitment to clear writing. From the Gendered World book, our world is filled with injustice, inequality, and pain. It's also filled with hope and promise that grow from the many people who resist injustice and promote potential and pleasure. Their book is dedicated to that goal, to furthering those ends, and so was her life. A red diaper baby she was born, and a red diaper baby she remained. Certainly one of the people who would be most proud of the life that she lived would be her original mentor, someone whom she adored, her father Saul. And as an activist, she was a pioneer. I think that word needs to be used more and more these days. Women's studies, sociologists for women in society, the Peace and Freedom Party movement, the New American movement, and perhaps most importantly, Jane. Well, let's let her tell us about that. What follows is a 2.5-minute clip of a conversation that we had around her kitchen table with our guru, Dorothy Smith. When I connected with Dorothy Smith a couple of weeks ago to tell her about Judy's passing, we reminisced, and then Dorothy went on to celebrate the fact of her new book, which has just come out, just prior to her 96th birthday. So here is Dorothy Smith from the magical technology of the 1980s I hope it works. It's an old cassette tape. But it lasts 2.5 minutes, and it's Dorothy, and mostly it's Judy, telling about her activist days. And it begins with the pouring of a glass of beer. Aaron?
Well, I'll just have a little bit then. Thank you.
Well, there's lots of time.
So when you involved in, like, your passionate organizing, like, what were you doing?
Cleaning the house, taking care of your children.
No. In addition to that, I mean, I'm taking for granted that, God was doing those things too. But you were also saying that, you were active in organizing and so on, like, passionately.
When I went back to Roosevelt, I got involved in certain things, this and that. I got involved with Jane.
What's that again?
I got involved with Jane.
I mean, what is it? What's it?
It was an illegal abortion collective that was organized by Southside women, and I became their Northside counselor. I never did abortions, but I was involved with anybody who came from the North Side. And what else did I do? Oh, we had, there were open housing demonstrations in Evanston when we moved in, so we joined those. That's how I met Elaine. And we started, somebody who came here to Northwestern in the math department started the Peace and Freedom. He came here from California, from Venice. So he started the Peace and Freedom Party chapter here. So we were active in the Peace and Freedom Party and the Evanston Peace Center, which was, kind of the Peace and Freedom Party. So we were always on the go with anti-war, stuff like that. What else? We ran the Peace and Freedom Party, we ran candidates, and then Elaine ran for mayor 1 year.
Did you,
no,
when you...
Sorry.
Well, I was going to ask about the Peace and Freedom Party, whether there were sort of feminist struggles like within that party organization.
When I went to take that first course at Roosevelt, one of the things we had to do was the political science course that he taught. One of the things I had to do was to study some group, I think. But anyway, I took the occasion to, my group was the 49th Ward CIPA, Committee for Independent Political Action, which was one of Clark Kissinger, who was at the time a famous left activist, certainly locally famous. Clark and some other people had organized this community group, and they worked with Amy Kesselman, who was one of the women's movement people, worked to establish a teen drop-in center called the Poison Cookie Hole on Howard Street, which actually did open. And this group had, now I'm forgetting a lot of things.
But you're remembering a lot.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, but, I have had a long life. But,
Tape, an hour and a half. But she just said, I've had a long life. And that was 40 years ago. So I just want to mention quickly her mentioning of Jane, which is quite relevant. This was the clinic that served thousands of women and girls. The code word, Jane was a code word. People would call up and say, hello, is Jane there? And that was the way that they would proceed to get help. It's notable, heaven forbid, not because some may need their services yet again, but because HBO, home box office, is airing a documentary next week, June 8th, Wednesday, 9 p.m., on the Janes, featuring the founder, Heather Booth. Now, chances are very good that as they flip through those archives, in that documentary, there will be our pioneer chanting and marching and holding up the cause of reproductive rights for the whole North Side. Watch for her. So, Judy, wherever you are, please know that we will be turning to you for inspiration and to, in your words, fight injustice and work for the cause of freedom and what were her words? Potential and pleasure. So, Judy, it's true we're going to miss you, but even more true that we were, so privileged to have you. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm Nathaniel. I'm the oldest grandson. We heard a lot today about everybody's perceptions and experiences with Grandma, and I'd like to share my own, which were pretty awesome. It's pretty rock and roll having her as a grandma. Because one thing, I used to go to her house every Sunday when I was a kid. And I would see her more than that even, maybe more than once a week, but I grew up really close with her. And that was great because I could watch whatever movies I wanted to at her house. I could watch R-rated movies, I could watch violent movies, anything. And one day I was sitting in her living room watching The Terminator, and I was 10 years old, which is a little, anyway. She kind of burst into the room in her, she's got a frantic way that she bursts into rooms sometimes. She bursts into the room and she goes, "Nathaniel, never trust anyone over 30. And that was it. That was her message to me. It's kind of, it's an odd packaging, but maybe an important message, right? And I think I know what she meant to say, which is that you should never trust that the world is the way that it is because it has to be that way. That some people, not to generalize, but some people might say, this is how it is because I've always lived my life and it's always been this way, and it's going to stay that way. And I don't think she believed that. I think, maybe as they say, kindergartners make the most revolutionary comrades, right? I think that's what she was trying to tell me, was something about curiosity and imagination. So I was 10 that day, and she was more than 10, I don't remember. And I admired her youthfulness. And that's what I get to carry with me for the rest of my life. That's how I remember her. And I remember, so at the beginning, you told your two stories, and I hadn't heard either of those two stories before. And I did cry while you were telling those stories, and it's because she sounded so much like a kindergartner. In both ways. She might burst into the room naked with an alarm clock, and also, who would come up with that third option that she came up with? Only somebody who didn't accept things. So, that's the gift that I kind of got from her, and I'm glad that my parents gave me the gift of having a childhood full of Grandma, because I got to spend every week at least with her.
So we've heard a lot today about Grandma, obviously, and I just want to reiterate and address just the impact that she left on me and my life, because it was really big for me. Well, it's huge for me, and I haven't really chosen to like address it ever before. But I think when I was probably like 12 or 13, I remember she had bought me my first pair of, it was always a thing that when she came to town, she would take me to this shoe store, soccer shoe store, and I would pick out like a new cool pair of shoes and whatnot. And then this one time I started to get into like a little more fancy, I started to like fancier shoes. And I asked my mom and dad, obviously, they were like, "Are you ridiculous?" And then she comes into town, and I show them to her, and she's more than happy to go get them for me. So yeah, and I remember the shoe so vividly. It's a New Balance 990 Boston, maroon, suede, green. I remember it all. I love the shoe. And that's actually the first shoe that I started. It's the first shoe that I sold of mine. And since then, I've made like a career out of it, and she inadvertently started that whole career for me, and I've taken it pretty far, and it's just so amazing to just like be able to realize that like it all came together in just one big circle. It started with her, and then where my success started happening right around when she passed away. So it really was just like a big circle, and yeah, that's kind of the impact that she had on me, and I'll carry that the rest of my life, no matter what. And yeah.
Okay, I'm the final grandchild to speak. I'm the oldest granddaughter. I'm Molly, for those of you who don't know me. And as my cousins know, I spent quite a while trying to decide what I wanted to talk about today. There's a very long note on my phone with all of the ideas. And originally, I wanted to talk about how smart and sharp and independent my grandma was, and how, as I've gotten older, I realized more and more how inspiring she is, how in a moment in our country that feels really frightening and a little bit hopeless, I think often of her boundless energy and her determination. But then I realized, you all probably know that side of her a lot better than I did, and perhaps what some people here don't know is what she was like as a grandmother. So, Judy, Poopsie, as my siblings and I called her, or Grandma, as my cousins called her. You might not know what a magic pancake is. I'm not sure that I know what a magic pancake is either. But every time we would see her, she would have a stack of them ready by the time we woke up, and she's the only person who can make them, so I'm sad to say, maybe a while before we can replicate that. And you probably never saw the giant cardboard box her TV came in that she kept for years so that whenever we came to visit, we could play house in it. You may not know that she would give up her bedroom and her computer for hours so that Alex and I could play Club Penguin and talk about the nuances of puffle ownership. It's a very complicated topic. You probably did hear about how well into her 70s she traveled by herself to Guatemala to work with a bunch of 20-somethings, and after that she met the rest of my family, and we met Mario's birth family for the first time. But if you knew Poopsie, I'm sure none of that really comes as any surprise. That she was generous, selfless, caring, eclectic, creative, brave. And you certainly know the side of her that we didn't necessarily know as well when we were younger: fierce, strong, determined, fearless. I'm so proud to be related to such a remarkable woman. I boast constantly about her accomplishments, and I see her often in my mother, my aunt, my siblings, and my cousins. In her absence, her memory will be a reminder to me to live my life not just with determination, but also with compassion, to be fierce, but also to be generous, and to think of others more than I think of myself.
Oh no, the earring thing. There we go. Just taking in everything that everybody has said and what my own mother has said. Thank you all for coming and for being a part of my mom's life. I'm Liz, her younger daughter, and thank you all for joining in virtually as well. We feel you here with us. I've gathered some memories, and this was really hard for me, as John knows. I spent a lot of time thinking and writing and scrapping things and thinking and writing and then realizing it was too long and too much. So I tried to be brief, but it was impossible, and now I'm at the end, and I just, I'll try to get through this. So this is about my mom as a mom. I remember holding her hand a lot. I always wanted to hold her hand. And I remember flowers. A lot of people have talked about that. I remember smelling flowers with her, and she'd name them. Remember the best smells and the best names, the lilies of the valley, and the bachelor buttons, and the Queen Anne's lace, and crouching on the ground, watching her pull weeds, and she'd show me a ladybug or a grasshopper. She taught me to regard the world with awe and wonder. And art, she always encouraged us to create. We had finger paints and charcoals and an easel. She brought us smelly markers that we could use to draw on the actual walls. She taught me how to draw a face by splitting it up into 3 parts, just like her dad had taught her. And I thought she was a real artist. Once, when I had a terrible nightmare about a house-eating ant, she told me to draw it. And amazingly, on that napkin, I saw this ant like a cartoon, and it was funny, and it was completely under my control with that red crayon. I don't know how she knew to do that, but it worked. And so much cooking. The yucky, healthy stuff, yes, but also the birthday cakes shaped into the number of our new ages. Nothing like anticipating that 4 cake, the 5 cake, the 6 cake, and on and on. The candles on top. She did this for the grandkids, too. I remember summers picking through rocks with her at South Boulevard Beach and finding one with this gash with all the glitter sparkling out of it. She said it was a geode. And she also told me that there were people called geologists. So for my newfound early career aspirations, she would take me to Dave's Rock Shop. And even for my 7th birthday, she bought me a rock polisher, which is very disappointing, actually. But she taught me that I could do or be anything I wanted. And she did that mostly in the way that she lived her own life. Just as I was starting school, Mom, newly divorced, went back to school to get first her master's and then her PhD. So many books and papers. What I remember from those days was listening to the rhythm of her typing, watching her fingers fly over the keyboard, transcribing hours and hours of words from the foster kids she interviewed for her dissertation. And I remember all the people filling our house, their impassioned discussions about the war and women's rights and capitalism and fascists and impeach Nixon and elect Elaine Shinbrot mayor. Mom's legendary generosity and warmth pulled a motley crew of people in from near and far, filling every room in the house and spilling out onto the backyard. All the giant pots of food, dishes piling up in the sink. We never had enough chairs or classes, but she taught me that it's important to share what you have. She showed me in the largest and smallest ways how to stand up for what's right. She truly believed that we both have the power and the obligation to make a better world. I joined her in protests, parades, marches. Even in the pharmacy, you could not walk past injustice. In the aisle of the Walgreens, we saw a woman applying lipstick and then putting it back where other people might then buy it. Mom wheeled around, stared her straight in the eyes, this woman twice as big as she was, and she said, "That is antisocial." This to me was just thrilling. The combination of her strong voice, her big words, her power, and the insistence on hygiene that she inherited from her own mother. My mom was a badass. She was my hero, until she wasn't. That came sometime after the 10 cake when I noticed and began to care very much that she was not like the other moms. Could she not just be normal? Could she not shave her armpits? Could she not have some rules? Ground us, give us a curfew, not allow us to write on the walls with the stinky markers. I wanted the weird people to leave our house. Her extreme generosity began to feel like a lack of boundaries. Her righteousness began to feel like self-righteousness. I did not want to hold her hand anymore. During all this time of my growing awareness that my mom knew nothing and I knew everything, she was establishing the first women's studies program at a Jesuit university, winning teaching awards, publishing important work, giving workshops all over the world on ethnography and fieldwork. She was fighting racism and sexism and standing up for workers' rights. I mean, really, what did she know? But some of us here may know that being an adult is humbling, and in particular, being a parent will bring you to your knees. When my babies arrived, first 1, 2, then 3, Mom came to help. In fact, she cooked so much that her hands hurt afterwards. Side note, though she had babies of her own, too, I still knew more than she did. They were mine. I corrected her when she was holding them, of course, but she waved me off, and she adored them. All of her grandchildren, Nathaniel, Alex, Mario, Lily, Molly, they were a source of so much joy for her. And I love my kids too, but you know, sometimes things can get a little complicated during the teenage years. Those years when my kids discovered, like I had, that they knew way more than their mom. Okay, sorry, Molly. I remember calling Mom one day after a particularly spicy car ride to the barn. And I said, "Mom, how? How did you do this?" And she just laughed. And as my kids grew and I shrunk, I began to see Mom in a different way. Maybe not the infallible hero of my childhood, but as an actual imperfect and sometimes difficult, challenging, but totally remarkable human, a fantastically weird, dancing, gap-toothed, committed, passionate, brilliant, frustrating person whom I admire greatly. Sadly, I waited to tell her how I felt. Over the past 7 years, Jenny and I watched her gradually lose her brain function and consequently her autonomy and her language. It was the worst thing for this smart ass-kicker revolutionary who'd been so independent, fierce, and courageous. She had done it all by herself when there was no help. Now, we were telling her that she needed help. We were taking her car, taking over her house, taking everything. It was awful, and it was heartbreaking. And right here, I want to acknowledge my sister, Jenny, for absorbing the brunt of my mother's anger and fear. sorry, for bearing that mostly alone and continuing week after week to plan for and provide generous care for my mom, along with Afsani, Marcos, Maimo, some amazing friends and family who came to help. But Jenny was here the whole time, getting the emergency calls, the calls from neighbors or the police. I was in Virginia and I could come for a visit, but I always flew back out. I'm eternally grateful for Jenny's many difficult and complicated years of care for Mom. This cannot be overstated. As my mom settled into a new, more limited life, a certain sweetness emerged. She maintained some of her wry sense of humor and warmth. She smiled a lot. I held her hand again, and I began to tell her everything, how she amazed me, how she impacted so many people, how she was a giant to me. Though words had already begun to elude her, she would bat away at the air when I spoke like this, and even once came up with one of my favorite mom words, phooey. When she died, I should not have been surprised by the throngs of students, colleagues, and friends who talked about her impact, but it still blew me away, and it filled me with pride. And when I came back home to Virginia from Chicago, Lily, my youngest, 17 years old, whose most vivid recollections of her grandma were mostly the 7 years of her creeping dementia, showed me the short bio of Mom she had found online. She burst into tears and she said, "I never knew how amazing she was." I think many of you here do know, and that's why you're here. But I want everyone to know. She was remarkable. She was colorful. She was complicated, real, and frustrating, and wonderful. When I said goodbye to Mom, I held her hands. Those hardworking hands that had always looked so strong now looked even more incredible to me. Her fingers, twisted now from years of arthritis. I held those hands that had washed so many dishes, baked so many cakes, typed so many words, created so much. Hands that once held me and made me safe. The hands I batted away, and the hands that were now so dear to me. When I said goodbye to her, as soon as I walked out the door, my fingers started throbbing. It was the strangest thing. I rubbed this aching spot, and I found a bump. I don't know if you can see it, but there's a bump. And my finger, which now has a Band-Aid, thank you, Lisa, which also reminded me of my mom, who always had bumps and gashes on her fingers. It looked like my mom's finger. It looked older, and there was this crooked path. She died not long after that ache started. I often wonder where somebody goes after they die. I wish I were more religious and had some certainty about it. But as my pointer finger throbs occasionally, I think about how Mom settles into me, how we all incorporate her, how she will live on in her grandchildren, in me, in my sister, in all of us. Clearly, this is not actual science, but it feels to me that death may just be a rearrangement of certain molecules, and this way, I can still hold her hand, and maybe more than ever, her life will help point the way for many of us. Thank you.
I want to thank you all for coming here and sharing this day with us. It's been very meaningful to have you with us, and we really appreciate it. I want to thank my sister for organizing and curating this day and figuring it all out, and also for being a really good partner through the 7 years of my mom's illness and figuring out everything then that needed to be figured out too. I want to invite you all to join us in the back there, where we can share further memories of Mom or just talk. And then I want to invite you all to my house tomorrow for a brunch, an open house. The address is posted in the back there. I invite you to take a picture of it so you can remember what the address is, but you're all welcome tomorrow for lox and bagels and a brunch in the evening. Thanks, everyone. Let's all now get up and go in the back and enjoy each other's company.